Hey everybody, Mr. Harvey here. Let's continue our lecture on chapter 21, and we're going to talk a little bit about radical Islam. So radical Islam, ladies and gentlemen, had been a growing force during the late 19th and early 20th century. And remember, there was a lot of change in the Middle East going on during this time. Remember, we saw the Ottoman Empire slowly starting to fall, and it does fall in the early 20th century in World War I. Remember the mandate system, the creation of Israel. So there's a lot of changes in the Middle East that's going to help facilitate this. It's going to rise in conjunction and reaction to some of the Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism that we see in the 20s and 30s. A good example of that is the creation of Turkey. Ideologically, it's important to understand that radical Islamists reject the West. They reject Western ideals, like politically, like communism, socialism, democracy, Western culture, and they want to mold their society economically, culturally, religiously, politically, based on Islam. Economically, in the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, just to give you some context, the Middle East is very much a powerhouse when it comes to fossil fuels and oil. A lot of countries, that is their main economic engine. And some countries have really prospered off this, while others have, kind of not been able to get into the oil industry because they don't necessarily have the natural resource. But radical Islam has touched the majority of the Middle East and is still obviously around today, as we've seen most recently with ISIS. One of the big events in the Middle East that illustrated some of the rise of more radical Islamic groups and radical Islamic ideals was the Iranian Revolution of 1798. It was led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and this is the creation of a theocracy. This was the creation of Iran governed by religion, where the clergy, where religious figures had a final say in all matters, politically, economically, and socially. And this revolution was really an embodiment of Islamic fundamentalism and more radical Islamic ideals. This was a direct challenge to the westernization of the Middle East, to the secularization of the Middle East, to Western intrusion, culturally, politically, economically, into the Middle East. This was a direct challenge also to one of the leading Western powers, and not just the United States, but Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and also Israel, which many Islamic and Arab groups felt was a pawn of the West, created because of the West, allowed to survive because of the West. And so the Iranian Revolution definitely is a key moment within the Middle East, in the history of the Middle East, when it comes to some of the more radical Islamic movements. Afghanistan as well. We talked previously about Russia invading Afghanistan, during the Cold War. And we're going to see Muslims declare a holy war, a jihad against the Soviet Union. And we're going to see thousands of Muslims all around the Middle East arrive in Afghanistan to fight off the Soviets. And this was in the name of Islam. Many of these Muslim groups, fighters, were fighting against what they saw the westernization of the Middle East. And they were in the United States. This was a big problem for the United States, and this was kind of just the short-sightedness of the United States and Britain and France. I mean, the Western powers, the NATO powers, was they just saw this as a front of the Cold War, while to the Afghanistans, this wasn't necessarily to do with the Cold War, but this was to do with their religion, with their culture, with their society. That's going to be a big problem for many of the Western countries as we see radical Islamic groups, as we're going to see terrorism, rise during the 20th century, and the 21st century. That's a big problem. Is that some of these NATO countries they don't see it necessarily as a cultural war. They especially during the Cold War viewed it as a front of the Cold War, which was a problem. A group in Afghanistan that's going to become very prominent, especially after the Soviet Union leaves, is the Taliban. They're going to be a radical Islamic group that's going to impose Muslim law throughout Afghanistan. And they're going to allow other radical Islamic groups like Al-Qaeda, who's responsible for 9/11, to flourish in the country. Al-Qaeda was a group of Muslim terrorists supported by the Taliban. And again, they were a group that rejected Western culture and had a hostile nature towards the United States, towards Israel, and other Western countries. Soviet Union, later Russia, Britain, France, Germany, countries that they felt that were imposing their Western culture on the Middle East. And here are some of these radical Muslim fighters. And as you can see, they were heavily armed and fighting for their culture. Excuse me. We're going to see jihad against the United States. It really starts when the United States injects itself into the Middle East with the Persian Gulf War of 1991. This had to do with Saddam Hussein, and the United States was driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And the fact that the United States was working with some Arab governments like Saudi Arabia horrified and really angered some of the religious extremist leaders in the Middle East, like Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden. And we're going to see a lot of Muslim groups declare jihad against the United States. We're going to see terrorist attacks in 1993 on the World Trade Center. But the biggest one is 9/11, where the World Trade Centers are bombed again on 9/11, which was devastating. I remember that when I was a kid. I was in 7th grade. Definitely very scary. Just a tragic day in the history of the United States, but for the whole world. The United States, the president at that time was George W. Bush, son of the previous George W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. George W. Bush is going to respond to 9/11 by attacking the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we're also going to see the United States get involved in Iraq as well. Bush is going to attack Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction and citing dangers to the United States. And this was very controversial. You had a lot of people really upset about the United States getting involved in the Middle East. They felt this was kind of almost like a repeat of Vietnam. This was kind of a repeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But we are going to see the United States with other countries invade Iraq in 2003. We're going to see the Iraqi government collapse, but this invasion is going to be very, very divisive. It's going to be there's going to be a lot of criticism on the United States for this, and we're going to see a lot of European countries split on whether they wanted to support the United States in the Middle East with this. The United States, there were a lot of anti-war protesters in the United States, and the United States never found any of these weapons of mass destruction that they were looking for. After the invasion and occupation of Iraq, we're going to see a lot of terrorism in Europe itself. There was terrorist attacks in Spain, in London. Bush is going to be reelected in 2004. But there's going to be a lot of instability with Saddam Hussein kind of kicked out of power in Iraq. And with Barack Obama president, he's going to completely remove the United States troops from Iraq. You're going to see kind of a huge vacuum of power within Iraq, and there's a new religious group that will rise, and that's going to be ISIS, who will start to take power during the Obama administration. Okay, and here was a terrorist attack in Europe, a bombing. Okay, and that is it for this lecture today. Thank you so much for coming.